Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you once again for joining us this evening on another episode of Through My Eyes with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Prof, welcome to the program this evening.
Thank you very much for having me on your program, and I look forward to interaction with our viewers.
Fantastic. Prof, let's start the program today by going all the way to Australia. Over the last few months, we've seen Australia being very, very active on the diplomatic scene. If they're not talking about uh, uh, their embassy in Afghanistan, they're talking about weapons deals with the United States and receiving arms. But, Prof, is Australia biting more than it can chew?
Well, Australia is fighting an existential battle. Australia and New Zealand are actually at the eastern outposts on the South Asian frontier. Um, they are the outposts of Western civilization. Let's just put things that clearly. Uh, they were colonies sent out by the British to establish, as I said, outposts of Western civilization. And they had remained so. I don't want to put it in racial terms, but uh, in Australia, the white colonists from Britain met the people they call the Aboriginal people, who don't call themselves that, but they met, an indigenous people there. And no indigenous person has ever been prime minister of Australia or uh, headed any of the political parties in Australia. And even the Australian Constitution itself barely gives a nod to the existence of the indigenous people. So, Australia, New Zealand have been those outposts. Now, there is a problem, or there is an issue arising. That issue is that there is an Asian superpower that has come on board. And now Australia and New Zealand have to make up their mind. Are they South Asian countries or are they Western countries, Western civilizational countries? They need to make up their mind. And it's not an issue that is going to be resolved overnight. It's an issue that will create conundrums around as several issues pop up. And unfortunately, the issues that are going to pop up, which are going to create these conundrums, really will have very little to do with Australia itself. They will have to do with the relationship between the United States on one hand and China on the other hand. And it's going to be extremely difficult for the ruling elite in Australia to shed its attachment with the West. It's going to be extremely difficult. And so over the next, not even few, over the next several years, You are going to be getting Australia taking positions on issues that are going to define whether Australia will survive as it is now, or what kind of modifications Australia will need to make. But definitely, we can expect that the present generation of Australian leaders and several members of the elite are probably going to be looking for visas to either England or the United States.
Prof, when we look at the challenge they're having with China today, even to the point that China has issued a warning that Australia, you're going to be the first we're going to hit. We're also seeing that influx of weapons from the United States into Australia. Can Australia take on China at all?
Um, let me tell viewers a little story which carries sufficient moral lessons. The lion was going on a stroll in the afternoon, feeling very hungry, looking for lunch, and he came across the tortoise. And he said, "Well, you are not really what I had in mind for lunch, but you will do." And the tortoise said to the lion, "Fine. Can you just give me 5 minutes?" The lion thought, "Well, yes, I'll give you 5 minutes." So they was rather puzzled by the demand. So the tortoise, started tearing up vegetable, soil, all the things around him, throwing them into the air. And the lion was, then finally the lion said, "Wait a minute, what are you doing?" And the tortoise said, "Look, I know you are going to eat me, but whoever passes by this, I want him." My goodness, what a brave tortoise. What a brave, what he put up such a fight. Look at all this, soil. Look at all this vegetable. Oh, man, the tortoise deserves to have uh, uh, um, maybe something put up here to recognize his bravery. So, what is Australia going to do to take on China? What exactly? I don't know. But definitely, in terms of strategic analysis, the United States will have to back Australia for it to be able to stand up to China. But this now brings up what, when I was a graduate student in the 60s, in studying international relations, what we used to call the New York syndrome. And what was the New York syndrome? It was in defining the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union vis-a-vis Europe. If the Soviet Union moves into Belgium, would the United States be prepared to sacrifice New York in order to defend Belgium? And the answer is no. No. I mean, if the Soviet Union moves to Belgium, In order to defend Belgium, the United States decides to bomb Petrograd, and the Soviet Union, in retaliation, decides to bomb New York. What American president will take such an option and will make such a choice? None. So and at that time, that was, the phraseology that was used. So I will turn it around now and say, if China decides to hit Sydney in Australia because of something Australia has done, will America decide that it will risk China bombing Washington, D.C. by bombing one of the cities of China because it has bombed Sydney in Australia? Of course, it's not going to happen. It won't probably get to that, but China will simply be nipping away at the edges of American influence in Southeast Asia until it becomes the recognized power and authority in that area.
But Prof, given the amount of deals, trade deals, and military weapons specifically now, I think the record puts it at about 1.9 billion, just under $2 billion of arms going to Australia from the United States. Is the US considering the Australia as some sort of strategic partner against China in that region?
Obviously, obviously, the United States has that in mind. But then that is only something that is temporary. It's a transitional arrangement. As I said earlier on, Australia has been the outpost. It's now been strengthened to take on its own defense and to raise the cost to China of any moves against Australia. But 2 billion is nothing in terms of $2 billion. It's nothing in terms of supply of arms and armament when you compare how much the United States sends to Israel. It's only a pittance what it is sending to Australia. And yes, there's going to be a string of what I will call island outposts. Taiwan is one. They wanted to do it with Hong Kong. China put down its feet. New Zealand is one. Australia is one. And then you then have the Philippines. There's a whole string of them who have to make up their mind, where do we belong? In the Western Alliance or in the Southeastern Alliance?
Before we leave Australia, there is one other move that the Australian government has made recently, and that is the issue around their embassy in Afghanistan. They've ordered the closure of their embassy on the basis that the American forces are leaving Afghanistan. Is that premature of them to do that? And would you say that other countries should be following in the footsteps of Australia?
No, it's not premature at all. It's just a recognition of the reality that it is American military might that has sustained the Afghanistan present structure and that has sustained the presence of Western structural interests, embassies, trade missions, what have you, in Afghanistan. And as America runs it down the clock, people who operated under that general strategic umbrella will get out, or you find yourself exposed to, this happened in South Vietnam. As soon as the United States decides to wind down embassies, trade missions started to leave the South Vietnam in the hope, which has been proved right, that after South Vietnam and North Vietnam have solved their problems, their unification problems, then new negotiations will take place, and these embassies will now be reestablished, but under a new sovereignty, to put it that way. So there's no doubt that, I will advise any Western-oriented embassies to get out. Obviously, embassies, maybe Pakistan, maybe India, definitely the Chinese, will stay, because they will not be targets by the Taliban in the way in which Taliban will target Western interests and Western institutions in Afghanistan.
Thank you for that, Prof. Let's move to Africa. Some months back, we had the story of the coup in Mali, which was surprising to quite a lot of people. But now we have something else that they have some have termed a coup within a coup. Prof, what is your response to what's going on in Mali today?
I'm baffled. I'm baffled by what has happened. On this program, there had drawn attention to the fact that authorities, if they want to be realistic, should recognize where the real power behind the throne is, and ensure that they do nothing to antagonize that power behind the throne. I made that point very, very clearly when we were talking about Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, and the military regime there. And the military regime has shown her who holds the power in Myanmar. Now, Mali is another example of that. The military carried out a coup. It was the ECOWAS leaders who negotiated this delicate governmental structure where the military agreed to bring in a civilian president, a civilian prime minister, while the deputy and others, minister of defense, minister of finance, were strong military personalities. Now, obviously, there were problems within the government structure. And the prime minister reshuffled his cabinet, dropped the minister of defense, who was a military man, dropped the minister for security, who was a military man, without even consulting the vice president, who was the head of the junta that carried out the coup. I mean, somebody or some government must have put the civilians the president and the prime minister up to it. They say, go ahead and do it. We'll back you up. Or else they've been very, very foolish. It's not something I would have done. Well, I recognize who is the power behind the throne. That's no weakness. That's no cowardice. That's just being realistic. And they've just paid the price, not only in terms of their loss of office, but again throwing Mali into a state of instability by doing what they did. So it's just an act of foolishness. There are several theories going around that the military, especially the people uh, were thrown out under pressure by the French, the usual culprit, while the military itself, I understand, was leaning towards China. So this then became a power play between the Chinese and the French. Others said it is between the French and the Russians. Whatever it is, again, the Malians have become pawns in a game of political and strategic chess. Well, the French have said they will not recognize the new government. The vice president, by the way, has promoted himself to be president. But I find it interesting what the French have done. Under, the understanding that we all had from the time from the time I was minister, I thought up till now, there was an understanding that if there's a problem in a region in Africa, the organization in that region, in this case ECOWAS, will be allowed to deal with that situation and come out with uh, um, will come out with some uh, solution. If they cannot, then ECOWAS will go to the African Union to be seized of the matter. And if the African Union cannot resolve the issue, then the United Nations Security Council will become seized of the matter. So it surprised me that France immediately called for a meeting of the Security Council where it has a veto to deal with the matter, rather than calling on ECOWAS and the African Union to be seized of the matter first and to try and resolve it. France went over the head of these two organizations. To me, this is not the understanding, the diplomatic understanding we used to have, whereby African problems were resolved, leaving out, troublemakers who would like to meddle in African affairs to their own benefits. So those who see France behind the latest problem in Mali may not be wrong after all, may not be wrong. The same France that approved the coup on what it called essential security ground in Chad is now crying foul over the coup within a coup in Mali. There's no consistency in it, except, of course, French interests.
Hmm. Thank you for that, Prof. While we're on Africa, let us look at Ethiopia. Some episodes back, you talked about Ethiopia, what was going on in the Tigray region, and the killings that was going on there. But now the Americans have passed sanctions against Ethiopia. Is this the right thing for them to be doing at this stage?
No, the United States is wrong. And I hope Biden, who, I mean, we have all touted as a specialist in foreign policy, would not rush into implementing the sanctions put down by the Senate. You will recall that I warned at the beginning of the Ethiopian crisis that irrespective of whether the Tigray people have some rights on their side, that their leaders were leading them, the Tigray people, into a military cul-de-sac because the Ethiopian army is one of the best trained army in Africa. And for the Tigray movement to take on uh, uh, the Ethiopian army was asking for their people trouble, or on behalf of their people, trouble should they not be able to handle. Where are those leaders now? They've run into mountains. Some of them have escaped into neighboring countries, while you have left the people you say you were representing to the not too tender masses of the Ethiopian army and the Eritrean army. I warned against it at that time. You know, journalists were going in there. Everybody was talking about the brave Tigrayan people and so on. I said, I know how all this is going to end up in tears. And following what the American Senate had now done in imposing sanctions against some Ethiopian leaders, I think Ororo People's Movement had now raised up their heads that why is the world, getting worried about the Tigray people who are only 5% of the population, while the Ororo people are 55% of the population of Ethiopia, and they are also suffering, and they are raising their flags of rebellion as well, self-determination, etc., etc. See, when things like this happen, you just provide business for arms merchants. Your people suffer. They suffer a lot. I've seen enough suffering in my life of innocent people, children and women, while leaders disappear into wherever they disappear to. During the recent war between Israel and the Palestinians, the head of Hamas was not in Gaza. He was issuing statements from one of the neighboring countries, one of the neighboring Arab countries. That's where he was in safety, while his people were being pummeled. The same thing has happened in Tigray, and the same thing is going to happen in any other African country that where without being prepared, without being armed, you're going to challenge the authority of the central government. If you're going to do that without paying a horrendous price, then be armed yourself, be prepared, do your risk analysis, and see at what level will you be able to impose unacceptable damages on the central government to make the central government negotiate with you. But apart from that, you're just going to be complicit in the genocide that is going to happen. And believe me, none of the sanctions which will be imposed will assuage or change anything on the ground. None.
But, Prof, let's take the United States, put them out to one side. Um, how about the African Union? How about other bodies within Africa? Could they come up with some semblance of sanctions to compel this military government to leave a government in excuse me, in Ethiopia, to compel the government, not the military government, but the government, to start to listen more to the Tigray and try to find diplomatic solutions.
I understand the point you have raised. I've seen much diplomatic activities on the African scene concerning several issues actually that face Africa. And I started to ask myself, although I have actually brought up this point about 20, 30 years ago, that after the struggle against apartheid, is there going to be anything, any issue on which Africa will be able to arouse that diplomatic passion that will make Africa count, whether in resolving its own affairs domestically or in even playing a role at the United Nations. And I've come to the conclusion that the post-apartheid period is going to pose a challenge to the African Union and what I thought they should be doing. And you could see the lethargy with which the African Union operates now. You could see the lethargy, whether it's because each African leader is too concerned with what is happening in his own country, or that the African leaders who should provide the leadership and the initiative and the vision for a post-apartheid Africa are simply not there. They are simply not there. So I can't see the African Union. They did send a team initially to Ethiopia before the war actually broke out, and they received a cold hearing from the Ethiopian government.
Prof, let's move to Belarus. For some of us looking at that situation, it felt strange that at this time in this century, you would have fighter jets being scrambled by government to force a civilian plane to land because a government wants to pick a journalist that they felt wasn't being favorable to them. What is your view on that, Prof?
What Belarusia did was criminal. It's against international aviation law. It's against practices of aviation. It's against the values and principles of Asian practice. It was dangerous. You could unsettle the pilots and the crew as to cause a crash. And you are setting a precedent that pilots may then start disregarding what they are hearing from the territorial cockpit, not cockpit, from the where territorial controllers, because that's from where they were told they think there may be a bomb on board, and therefore we are asking you to divert and go and land. And that was not even the closest airport. Next time, supposing the pilot refuses to obey, are you then going to shoot it down? Of course, in that area, there have been two mysterious airlines that have been shut down. One was a Japanese airline that was flying over the Soviet Union in the middle of the night. Was it Japanese or Korean? I'm not sure. And it was brought without, till today, because they couldn't find the black box. They still don't know whether communication between the pilots and the air controllers in the Soviet Union. The only country that will know, which will be the United States, which has the capability to monitor, is not saying anything. And of course, you would then remember there was another that crashed over Ukraine about 2 years ago or so. So in that general area, what I will call criminal air antagonism is not something that they find strange. So I think Belarus did the wrong thing. It's now getting hot for pilots and airlines. The EU has said European airlines should avoid Belarusian airspace. Russia now says if you are flying to the Soviet Union, they will not allow you to land if you avoid the Belarusian airspace. That you have to go through Belarusian airspace before you'll be allowed to land in Russia. And already today we have seen confusion as to pilots, whether they will not turn around and go back to where they started from. It is essential, and I must emphasize this. It is essential that the law of civil aviation be maintained for the safety of all of us who travel by air. And that means, how many? Most of the world who have things to do. We've gone now beyond the age of traveling by camel or canoe. So it is essential for the Security Council of the United Nations to be seized of this issue. I know Russia, which is Belarusian ally, has again a veto there in the Security Council, but Russia will have to be, it will have to be explained to Russia that it is in Russian interests as well for us to have stability in aviation practice and in aviation law. One man cannot bring down on the world, chaos in aviation. Having said that, let me also say that one of the things we often don't remember is that uh, people like the dictator in Belarus probably have a blueprint which they copy from, because I know that there have been interference with flights by superpowers in the past. Don't let me mention names. Only 3 years ago, uh, President Juarez, is that the name? The Indian president, when I say Indian, Indian president of, I think it's Colombia. There was all this confusion about his plane being diverted over Spain, and because they were afraid that if that plane landed, he would be taken off the plane by one of the superpowers. But all I'm just saying is, this is not the first time we will have this kind of criminality in civil aviation. Not the first time. I bet the last time, but I doubt it.
Prof, one last point on Belarus before we leave there is the dictator Lukashenko has now said he's going to open his borders, he's going to allow drugs, he's going to allow a huge influx of migrants into Europe as his response to the sanctions. Um, where would that leave Europe if that were to happen?
You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of Muammar Gaddafi. He warned Europe that he is the one who has been standing between influx into Europe of migrants from Africa. And that if anything happens to him, Europe will not be able to cope with the migrants that it will then be faced with. And since Muammar Gaddafi was killed, Europe has not known any peace in dealing with these illegal migrants, that especially that head for countries in the southern belt of Europe, Italy, Spain, even southern France, Malta, and what have you. I'm sure deep in their hearts now the Europeans leaders will wish they had listened to Muammar Gaddafi. If it's going to be Libyan problem, okay, let him remain Libya problem, but not for them to go in for regime change at a cost to themselves now. So, the Belarusian president is now saying, well, this is the only nuisance value I can be, opening my doors to allow, well, the kinds of things that you have mentioned: drugs, weapons, illegal immigrants, jihadists, I will, I don't know. But then, I mean, he may also then find out that it's also opening himself to then more retaliation from Europe. And well, there we are. It gives jobs to diplomats and ambassadors and creates, when they start to earn their salaries, let's put it that way, than just, attending diplomatic parties and so on.
Mm. Thank you for that, Prof. Okay, let's go to the United States. One of the things that President Joe Biden talked about early into his presidency was this issue of the Nord Stream 2 project, where he had come out very well against that project, and he didn't hide his displeasure about it. But this week, he's made a very big U-turn on this particular point. Um, Prof, two questions here. One, is this U-turn the right thing for him to have done? And secondly, is we've just finished the whole conflict with Israel, Gaza. There's been the talk of where is Biden's foreign policy capability. Now we're seeing another big U-turn on a major issue. What is your take on what is happening here with President Biden's foreign policy capability and also with this U turn on this major project between Russia and Germany?
Um, I I must say that it baffles me, um, the that it baffles me what is starting to look like unpreparedness on the part of the foreign policy and strategic team of Biden. Um, maybe, maybe they are starting to get overwhelmed by issues which they had hoped they wouldn't have to deal with at this point in time. They've only been there for 120 days or so, and all of a sudden they are coming hot and fast uh, onto the plate. You don't call a head of state that you need to deal with a murderer. It's not done. Um, and even though, yes, you could defend yourself by saying that the reality you met on the ground is quite different from what you thought would be during the campaign, and that is justifying. I don't mind. Actually, I don't mind U-turns. It's not such a bad idea, provided they're justifiable. I mean, to be really a head of state, a silly head of state, who will maintain a stand, right or wrong, when the facts, the realities are calling for a re-evaluation. But it is when it's then kind of becoming a routine matter that you then start um, to wonder the preparedness uh, and whether there are no small steady hands that could then be called upon to strengthen the national security team. Um, I had again said on this program before that the beauty of the American system was uh, that people who serve one administration, when that administration loses power, they go to think tanks, universities, or the private sector and cool their heels, waiting for the next time when their party will come back. And so they keep bringing in people who are already experienced, who've gone through, gone through not at secretary's level, but as under secretary, assistant secretary, and what have you. Uh, and that this is why, there's a stability in American foreign policy. Now, Trump seems to have upended that. And whether this is a continuation then, but there are people who worked under Obama Biden administration, who I will expect will be steady pair of hands, experienced, uh, rather than just, people who served with him in the Senate. The politics of the Senate in handling foreign affairs is totally different from, the policies that you will expect to come out of the White House. But I suppose under the under the syndrome of anything but Trump, we will continue to give Biden, and we'll continue to wish him well and wish the Americans well.
Prof, before we leave the US, just one last question. What's your view on the whole issue regarding the January 6th commission and the setting up of that?
I believe it's going to be a waste of time. It's going to be a waste of money for the very simple reason that the Republicans will not cooperate. And if they don't cooperate, then you will continue to have what Trump popularized in the White House as alternative narratives, alternative facts. Whereas you and I all know there cannot be alternative facts. There is just one set of facts. But and I don't see any sign at all of the Republicans being paid. The Republicans who could not find him guilty, find Trump guilty of his involvement in the January issue, will now be taking part in a bipartisan commission to take a look at that. You're going to waste time. You're going to waste money. Probably they should just move on and allow the Department of Justice to carry out its duties of the FBI investigating who did what on that day, and those who are found culpable being taken to court to face the law as it is. Now, in terms of protection for the capital, that is a different kettle of fish. If the Republicans refuse to cooperate, I don't even think you need their cooperation for the Capitol Police to restructure itself and become a more efficient, a more intelligence-driven organization, that next time this will not happen.
Prof, before we go, there's one last question here, and this is the issue of Switzerland going head to head with the European Union. Um, what is your take, Prof? Because what we're seeing here is medical supplies being impacted, tech companies that wouldn't be able to sell into the EU. And who's going to win this battle, Prof, between the EU and Switzerland?
No, the EU will win the battle. Um, I mean, I hate to use my analogy of the tortoise and the lion again, but the EU, the size of the EU, the size of the market compared to the size of the market of Switzerland, um, there's no battle. And I think you should be expecting this kinds of thing when there is an attempt to codify uh, economic relationship between one country and separate 22 countries into economic relationship between one country and the EU. Because really what's happening is that there are several agreements between Switzerland and several countries of the EU which cover all these things. And I think it's about 5 on which there's now they can't reach agreement. One is movement of workers, workers' rights. Well, I really can't keep the details in my head, but you will have differences and hard bargaining ahead of them. And as you could see with what happened with the British, really, I mean, you just kicked the can forward to be able to claim that Brexit has taken place. As we've seen with the fisheries issue between France and Britain, where naval ships, were ordered into action. You are going to be having this kind of problems as they seek to uniform or as they seek to bring several agreements on the same issue under one umbrella, there will be problems. But the EU will have the final word.
Prof, thank you so much. We've run out of time today, but thank you for your insight on all these topical issues. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us this evening. We'll be back again next week with another episode with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Prof?
Thank you for your companionship and your patience with us. I hope you've gained something. And should you have points on which you disagree with us, please let us know and they will be addressed.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you to our viewers. See you next week.